Today we have the testimony of Joshua, a gay man who has a near-death experience where he is revealed what happens to gay people like himself in the afterlife. Please like and subscribe as it helps us to continue publishing more testimonies like this. Joshua sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. The laughter and joy he saw in the pictures of his friends felt distant, like watching scenes from a movie he wasn't part of. Over the past few years, he'd built a life that looked good on the surface, lively friends, memorable nights out, and a well-curated social media presence. But every time he returned to his quiet apartment, he felt the same ache, a persistent loneliness that lingered despite the noise of his outward life. He wondered if something was missing, if maybe there was more to life than these fleeting moments. Joshua had been raised in a moderately religious family, though faith had not played a central role in his life for years. There was a time when he prayed daily, back when he thought he understood what it meant to be loved by God. Yet as he grew older and recognized his identity as a gay man, that sense of security faded. Religion had turned into a source of confusion and, at times, rejection. The teachings he'd grown up with seemed to conflict with who he was, leaving him to feel that faith was something that no longer belonged to him. He thought he could leave it all behind, the faith, the questions, the longing for something more. But on nights like this, when the world was quiet, the questions would creep back into his mind. Why did he feel so empty? Why did he feel like he was always searching for something he could never find? Growing up, Joshua had been a quiet, introspective child with a heart full of curiosity and wonder. He loved his family, and they loved him, but they never seemed to fully understand him. He was sensitive, sometimes tearful, and always searching for the why behind things, a trait that both his parents and his peers found perplexing. For a while, he found comfort in the church his family attended every Sunday. The stories of Jesus, the songs, and the prayers gave him a sense of peace, a grounding presence that made him feel safe. However, as he entered his teenage years, he began to realize he was different. The realization didn't come with a single moment but was a gradual awakening. While other boys spoke of their crushes, he felt something different. At first, he tried to deny it, hoping it was a phase that would pass. But as he grew older, the feelings only became stronger. By the time he was 18, he understood who he was, and he was terrified. When he finally told his parents, their response was a mixture of disappointment, confusion, and concern. His mother asked him to pray harder, while his father's reaction was colder, urging him to think about what this would mean for his life, for his family, and for his faith. Joshua felt that they saw him not as their son but as someone who had strayed from the path, someone who needed to be fixed. In the years that followed, Joshua drifted further from his family and from faith. He moved to a new city, where he built a life away from the expectations and judgments of his past. He found acceptance among friends who understood him, people who didn't ask him to change. But the emptiness remained, lingering in the quiet moments, and no amount of socializing, relationships, or distractions could fill it. One night, after a long evening out with friends, Joshua decided to drive home, despite feeling more tired than usual. It was late, and the streets were empty. The silence was almost soothing as he navigated the familiar route back to his apartment. As he rounded a sharp curve, his vision blurred for a moment, and he lost control. His car veered off the road, crashing through a guardrail and plunging down a small embankment. In the seconds that followed, Joshua felt everything go still, as though time had stopped. He was aware of a faint ringing in his ears and a growing darkness around him. His thoughts became muddled, and he felt his body growing numb. Then, there was a sensation of floating, as if he was drifting further away from himself. The world around him faded, replaced by an eerie, shadowy silence. He could no longer feel his body, and he wasn't sure if he was breathing. A wave of fear swept over him as he realized he was on the edge of something unknown, teetering on the brink of life and death. He tried to move, to call out, but no words came. Suddenly, he felt a pull, a cold, terrifying force drawing him downward. It was as if he was being dragged into a dark abyss. Shadows surrounded him, growing thicker and more oppressive. The sensation was suffocating, like being buried alive. He could hear faint, distant sounds, whispers, cries, and something that sounded like mocking laughter. The fear that gripped him was unlike anything he'd ever known, an all-encompassing dread that made him feel utterly helpless. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was powerless, a prisoner to the dark force that continued to drag him down, deeper and deeper into a realm he could barely comprehend. As Joshua descended further, the darkness gave way to a surreal landscape unlike anything he could have imagined. The ground beneath him was cracked and barren, stretching endlessly into a horizon lit by an ominous, reddish glow. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of sulfur and burning ash. Flickers of fire erupted sporadically across the ground, casting an unsettling light on the grotesque figures moving through the shadows. Everywhere he looked, he saw people, some bound in chains, others writhing on the ground, their faces twisted in anguish. They reached out, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with fear and regret. It was a place devoid of hope, filled with nothing but suffering and despair. The cries around him were a chorus of torment, echoing through the air with a chilling resonance. Joshua stumbled forward, his legs weak and trembling. He felt a presence behind him, something dark and sinister, watching his every move. He turned and caught a glimpse of figures moving in the shadows, demons, creatures with twisted forms and gleaming eyes, reveling in the misery around them. Their laughter was cruel, mocking, as they took pleasure in the suffering of those around them. As he walked, he realized that each soul here seemed to be trapped in a similar punishment, a manifestation of their choices in life. These were gay people who were being tormented for an eternity for committing homosexuality throughout their lifetime. He saw a man bound by chains that seemed to glow with an unnatural heat, his face etched with pain as he struggled to break free. Nearby, another man stood in a river of fire, his eyes filled with regret as he tried in vain to escape the flames. The weight of the suffering around him pressed on Joshua's heart. He felt a deep sorrow, not only for those he saw but for himself, for the life he had led, and for the choices that had brought him here. He had continuously committed one of the biggest sins in Christianity, homosexuality. As he wandered, lost and terrified, a piercing light appeared in the distance. Unlike the harsh, red glow of hell's fires, this light was warm, pure, and radiant. It cut through the darkness like a beacon, drawing Joshua's gaze. He felt an intense pull, an overwhelming desire to move toward it, as if the light itself was calling to him. With each step he took, the light grew brighter, and he began to feel a strange peace washing over him. The cries around him faded, and the darkness seemed to retreat in the presence of this light. Finally, he found himself standing before a figure clothed in white, surrounded by an aura so bright that he could hardly look directly at it. Yet he felt compelled to, his eyes drawn to the face of the one before him. It was Jesus. Joshua felt his knees grow weak as he stared at the figure, who looked upon him with a mixture of compassion and sadness. He had never felt such an intense presence, a love so pure that it was almost overwhelming. "Joshua," the figure spoke, his voice soft yet carrying a profound authority. "You are not meant for this place. But your choices have brought you here." Joshua trembled, unable to find the words to respond. He felt the weight of his actions, the choices he had made, the distance he had created between himself and this love. He was filled with remorse, a deep sorrow that brought tears to his eyes. Jesus continued, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." He stepped closer, reaching out a hand toward Joshua. "You have been given a second chance. But you must choose to turn from the path you have walked, to embrace truth and love." Joshua looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." Jesus smiled gently, his expression filled with understanding. "I am here to guide you. Choose life, Joshua, and you will find peace. Turn from the ways that led you here, and you will walk in the light. Or you will face a similar fate to those you have seen here." Jesus explained. "Those who have committed homosexuality face the wrath of God, Joshua, as Romans 1 verses 26 to 28 says, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done." Joshua was shocked to hear this, and Jesus continued, "Those who commit homosexuality are in danger of God's wrath. Turn from your ways, Joshua, and you will be saved." In that moment, Joshua felt an overwhelming sense of hope. He wanted to live, to turn away from the choices that had led him here, to embrace a life of truth, love, and purpose. He reached out, taking Jesus' hand, and felt a warmth fill his entire being. The next thing Joshua felt was the unmistakable, sterile scent of a hospital room. He blinked, his vision blurry, and for a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But as he looked around and saw the concerned faces of nurses and doctors, reality settled in. He was alive. The monitors beeped steadily beside him, and he felt the faint ache of injuries, though his mind was somewhere far from the hospital bed he lay on. He lay still, memories of his experience flooding back with overwhelming clarity. The terror, the darkness, the unimaginable scenes in hell, it had all felt so real. And then he remembered the light, the figure of Jesus, and the words that had stirred something deep inside him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." A powerful sense of peace filled him as he recalled that moment, the warmth of Jesus' presence dispelling the fear and despair that had consumed him. A nurse entered the room, surprised to see Joshua awake. "You're lucky to be alive," she said softly, her eyes filled with relief. "We didn't think you'd make it through the night." Joshua managed a weak nod, the words resonating with a new depth he could hardly explain. He felt deeply grateful, not just for surviving the accident, but for being given another chance at life. Yet, under the relief, there was a strange, gnawing feeling, a weight on his soul. He had seen what awaited him if he continued down his previous path, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. Over the next few days, as he rested and recovered, Joshua wrestled with the emotions and realizations that had surfaced in his near-death experience. He found himself revisiting memories from his past, reflecting on the choices he had made, the things he had done in search of love and acceptance, and the sense of emptiness that had followed him through it all. He was no longer content to continue living the way he had. Something within him had changed. He felt an intense desire, almost a need, to find truth and purpose in a way he had never felt before. When Joshua was finally discharged from the hospital, he returned to his apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the path ahead would be challenging. He would need to make difficult changes, confront the habits and attitudes he had formed, and step away from the comfort zones that had shaped his life for so long. But he was ready. For the first time, he felt a sense of direction, an internal compass that pointed him toward something meaningful, even if he couldn't see the full picture yet. Joshua decided to start by reaching out to a local church. Though he felt nervous, almost as if he were intruding on a place he wasn't meant to be, he found himself drawn there, guided by a feeling he couldn't ignore. Walking into the church felt like stepping into another world. The calm atmosphere, the gentle hum of voices, and the sight of people gathering in worship stirred something within him, reminding him of the peace he had felt in Jesus' presence. After the service, he hesitantly approached the pastor. They talked for a while, with Joshua recounting his near-death experience, his vision of hell, and his encounter with Jesus. Though his voice trembled, he found a sense of relief in sharing his story. The pastor listened with patience and compassion, his gaze never wavering as Joshua spoke. When Joshua finished, the pastor offered a warm smile. "You've been through something extraordinary, Joshua," the pastor said. "It sounds like God is calling you to a new path, one filled with truth and love. You don't have to walk this journey alone. We're here to support you." Joshua felt an overwhelming gratitude. For so long, he had kept his struggles to himself, thinking that no one could understand what he was going through. But here, in this simple conversation, he felt understood and accepted in a way he had never known before. It was as though he had found a glimpse of the belonging he had been searching for all his life. In the days that followed, Joshua began to spend time reading the Bible and reflecting on the teachings of Jesus. He found comfort in the words, feeling as though they were speaking directly to his heart. He realized that many of the teachings he had once dismissed now held profound truths, guiding him toward a life filled with love, humility, and compassion. Each verse seemed to illuminate a part of his soul, helping him understand the importance of forgiveness, not just toward others but toward himself. Joshua also began to let go of the things that had once defined him but no longer served his new path. He distanced himself from relationships and habits that pulled him away from his growing faith. Though it was difficult, he found strength in the belief that he was moving toward something greater, something that could finally fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. Several weeks later, Joshua was invited by the pastor to share his story with the congregation. He felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement at the thought of speaking in front of so many people. But he knew that sharing his experience was an important part of his journey. If his story could inspire even one person, it would be worth it. The day of the testimony, the church was filled with familiar faces, many of whom had seen Joshua quietly attending services over the past few weeks. As he stood before them, he took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began to speak. He started by recounting his background, his struggles, and the choices he had made in search of love and acceptance. He spoke openly about his near-death experience, describing the horrors of hell, the despair that had engulfed him, and the indescribable presence of Jesus who had pulled him from the darkness. As he spoke, he could see the congregation listening intently, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of compassion and understanding. "I thought I could fill the emptiness inside me with things that were temporary," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But nothing could fill that void until I encountered Jesus. He showed me a love beyond anything I'd ever known, a love that doesn't reject but embraces, that doesn't condemn but heals. And I realized that my life wasn't meant to be spent searching in the dark. It was meant to be lived in the light." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "I'm not perfect, and I still have a long way to go. But I've chosen to walk a new path, one guided by love and truth. And I know now that I don't have to walk it alone." When he finished, the congregation responded with applause, their encouragement and warmth filling the room. Joshua felt a sense of peace and fulfillment, a feeling he had never known before. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by people who accepted him for who he was, not for who he had been. In the months that followed, Joshua continued to grow in his faith, finding joy and purpose in the simple, everyday acts of kindness and compassion. He became involved in the church community, volunteering, offering support to those who struggled, and sharing his story with others who felt lost or rejected. Though he still faced challenges, he no longer felt alone. His encounter with Jesus had given him a new sense of direction, a new identity that transcended the labels he had once relied on. He was no longer defined by the past, by the choices he had made or the mistakes he had committed. Instead, he was defined by the love he had found, a love that had pulled him from the depths of despair and shown him a way forward. Joshua's journey was far from over, but he faced each day with a renewed spirit, trusting in the path he had chosen and the purpose that guided him. His life had transformed, not through fear or condemnation, but through grace, a grace that had given him a second chance, a new beginning, and a peace that surpassed all understanding.